The Politicrat is brought to you by the great people at Anchor. Anchor is such a great place to go if you want to get started in podcasting, and it's easy and it's free. Anchor, marvelous stuff, marvelous. And I'm so grateful to the folks at Anchor for getting me going with The Politicrat. If you want to get going and be heard on Apple, on Spotify, and everywhere podcasts can be, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Thursday, May the 28th, 2020. On today's episode, a conversation with Daniel Finkelstein. He is a columnist at the Times of London, and he is a Conservative member of the House of Lords at Westminster in central London. A conversation all about UK politics, Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, the Labour Party, the response to coronavirus by the government, and lots more. Coming up next. Thank you for coming on, Danny. It's really good to talk to you. A number of things while you have some time. First of all, what I would really like to talk to you about is the state of affairs. We have a lot of problems here, of course, in the US in a lot of different ways, but I'm sure in the UK it is certainly not that far different. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, what are your thoughts on what's going on there, particularly with what I call the calamity that's been going on with these lockdown rules? Can you talk about that and what your thoughts are?
Yes, well, the government obviously has instituted very serious and significant lockdown rules with almost 100% agreement. So there's a small fringe that disagrees, but it's nothing like the size or mainstream size of the US objections. In other words, that while it may be that the majority in the United States is with the lockdown, there are significant groups which want to defy it and be against it. And really in Britain, almost everybody has accorded to it and lived with it. Then early on, the Scottish Deputy Chief Medical Officer was recorded to have visited her a second home, which is against the lockdown rules. She did it for effectively kind of entertainment purposes, as it were, and she survived in office for a couple of days, but then it was felt she had to resign. And not long after that, Professor Neil Ferguson, much more central in some ways to our approach, because the person who'd done most of the important modelling, not very popular with the small fringe who are dubious about the lockdown. Some people think he's overestimated the numbers. I actually don't think he's done that. I think his number work has been pretty robust. He felt that having had the disease himself, it was all right for him to have his lover come to his house. And that obviously was, again, a breach of the lockdown terms, and he resigned. I actually was not in favour of him resigning. I thought the work that he was doing was too important. I felt it would have been satisfactory for him simply to apologise, to have been reprimanded, and I didn't think it did much harm to the public health approach of the government for him to stay. But it wasn't really questioned. He'd resigned before anyone knew what the story was, really, so there wasn't a debate about it. Now, the lockdown is slightly less strict, but it's been learnt that from before that period, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Dominic Cummings, had visited his family home, not, as it turned out, I think, to join his family there, but to use one of the properties there in order to be near his family for childcare purposes. Because there is a degree of flexibility in the rules regarding what you might do in so-called emergencies, the government chose to argue the toss on the basis that he hadn't broken the lockdown rules. I thought, even at that point, that was a foolish position to take. I thought that you could possibly argue the toss on it, but that it would be confusing and undermining. and that what should have happened almost immediately was that the government should have said, we accept that he broke the lockdown rules. If Boris Johnson then wanted to retain him, I wouldn't have regarded that as disproportional. He's not a figure that is particularly close to my own politics, but I understand he's the Prime Minister's senior advisor, and I think it would have been reasonable for him to say, he's apologised, I've explained to him that that wasn't the right thing to do. Unlike with the Chief Medical Officer and Neil Ferguson, it was actually for reasons of childcare rather than merely for his own entertainment. It wasn't frivolous, but it was wrong. And I think if he had done that, the government would then be having a debate about the proportionality of him leaving office versus, and a lot of people dislike Dominic Cummings, would have leapt on it, said he should leave, but I think it would have been a defensible position. And as I indeed said to several government people straight away, and I always say this whenever I'm advising any politician, I always say, please start with the truth on which you can base your political ideas, on which you can stand. You're in a much more robust position. I think they didn't do that. I can see how they can try and argue that he didn't break the lockdown rules. It's much less easy to argue that with the subsequent story about him visiting Barnard Castle, but you were bound to get into that. The moment that you started to defend the position, it would be much, much better from the beginning not to do that. I think it is overblown to think of Boris Johnson or Dominic Cummings as being like Donald Trump. I think that Boris Johnson altogether nicer person, which is important, because I think Donald Trump is a malicious individual. I think he's a much more educated and intelligent person. He may not have a great grasp of details. He's got many flaws and weaknesses, I think, as a Prime Minister, which led me to question him before he took the job. But it's not the same thing as Donald Trump, and I think it's dangerous to make that analogy. You ought to make that automatic equivalence. The analogy is a different matter, but the equivalence. But I do think that if the government's trying to introduce clear health messages, it's a mistake to have muddied those, and they should have understood that it would undermine them. And I think it has been, it was a serious political error, but I'm less concerned actually about that. I think it was a serious public health policy error and unnecessary. And it's the reason I raised Donald Trump is I think it does come from a similar view that there must be no concessions to a sort of excitable metropolitan press who are raising issues to try to break the government's policy. I think that is ridiculous and gets you into all sorts of unnecessary positions. And this was an example of that. And it hasn't necessarily over yet either.
Do you think, though, because as you mentioned the Scottish First Minister resigning, you mentioned Dr. Ferguson resigning, and remember, obviously, Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, also got into a little bit of hot water briefly. One of the things I want to ask you, though, there are now, about 50 Tory MPs who have either come out publicly to criticize him or have called for Dominic Cummings to go. Is that not something deeper than just this lockdown? Because obviously you've talked about they do not like him.
It's in some ways a fascinating and encouraging development. I said this again, I said this to people I talked to in the government on the morning when it first came out. One of the things about collective responsibility is everybody has to go and tell the story, right? And certainly if I'm not in this position, I don't have any responsibilities to them, but if I was in the position whereby I had to go on television and actually claim this didn't break the lockdown rules or that it didn't matter, the government, it would have been very difficult to get through an interview. And people are not necessarily willing to look stupid in front of their constituents, even before you take into account the question of their own ethics or where they might stand in relation to Dominic Cummings personally. If you place your line to take on weak foundations, you're expecting everybody to be able to sustain that, and they can't do that. So at a mere level of even the most elementary political tactics, it's always an error to do that, even before you take into account, which I think you should, the kind of the moral position, and it was inevitable, that you would get into a position whereby ministers would look incredibly unconvincing on television trying to defend something that's very hard to defend. And so why on earth they didn't put themselves on a stronger foundation? I think I know the reason. They let's leave aside kind of psychoanalysis of their politics, and where it differs from my own attitudes, and just deal with this particular thing. I think Dominic Cummings started with the view I behaved reasonably, and therefore I shouldn't have to apologise. And I think he just convinced himself of that, and it's always a mistake if you think of things only through your own eyes, right? Obviously he thought it was reasonable, or he wouldn't have done it. I don't think this was an instance where he kind of knew he was being naughty, but he did it anyway. I think he thought he was doing the right thing. But the moment you expose it to any scrutiny, you think to yourself, well, actually that isn't a good thing, and it doesn't feel and seem the right thing to have done. And then he could have apologised, and they've just dug themselves in to a very position difficult to sustain. I have to say something which is a slightly naughty confession, right? I find it hard to get myself into a great lather about it. I always do. I did over Peter Mandelson's mortgage. I did over, the row with Stephen Byers and Joe Moore. These are all British political rows, possibly of less knowledge. I did over MP's expenses, actually. It's just not the way I am. And I therefore, I always have to kind of listen very carefully to what other people are saying, because I can't rely on my own fury and indignation to guide me correctly. But I think I did, it's just because that's a matter of temperament, and possibly not good temperament either, because it can lend itself to complacency, and you can miss things that are morally wrong, I think, or be too lazy about them. But so I'm not saying it's necessarily a good characteristic, but it's a characteristic. So I've had to watch to see how deep it's gone with quite a lot of people, because you can see that it has, not with everybody, but certainly inside the political field. And also, Dominic Cummings is somebody who's got a lot of political enemies. If you behave quite as aggressively as he does to people who don't agree with him, and he has done, if you're so convinced, I happen to think Dominic Cummings is a very clever person, and some of his challenge to the to the way that politics operates in Britain is actually quite valuable, and very intelligent. Just to give you a funny example, he got into a sort of row about forecasting and told all the journalists to read Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock. That is a brilliant book, and I knew exactly what he meant, right? What he meant was we should be concentrating on signal rather than noise, right? And lots of journalism is about noise. But I think what he misses in that, so I think he's a valuable person in that way. But there are two things. First of all, I think the way that he behaves sometimes, people who know him, and I don't really, tell me that actually he's he can be quite nice to deal with. He's quite stimulating and quite pleasant, softly spoken person quite often in dealing with them. But not everyone says that, but quite a few people do. So I've had, people have told me that they found actually working with him quite invigorating because he's grasps the issues and all that. So, but nevertheless, he definitely is capable of behaving and has behaved in quite either passive-aggressive or straightforwardly aggressive ways, which I don't think mean he's got lots of friends at this moment. And that's not true actually. That means he's got lots of people who are possibly not friends. He has got lots of people who are friends, but he's got lots of people who are not willing to come to his defence because of the way that he's treated them, and that's never a good idea, however bright and intelligent you are. The second thing is there's a problem with his theory of politics. Forget the question whether this isn't actually, first of all, this is not solely a political question anyway, but even if it was, yes, it's true that politics should be about signal ultimately than noise. In other words, in 5 years' time, this is all like yesterday's shit paper, and it doesn't matter because people will have forgotten even who he is. He may not even be there. The whole issue will not affect the next general election, probably, right? That's what he thinks. But what he forgets is that half the fluctuations are actually just noise, right? You live with noise. Noise is a real thing, right? So there's no point telling a football manager who's lost the cup final that was just noise, right? Not signal. You're the best team, but that was just, and that's one of my areas of interest, which is football statistics, right? And the truth is that lots of winning and losing football games is literally statistical noise. You have a cluster of games, you happen to lose that one. But it's ridiculous to suggest that it doesn't matter because it was just noise, right? You still got knocked out of the cup. And so I think that there's something a bit wrong with his theory of politics, as well as his treatment of other people. And those things have come together to give him a very difficult time.
Right, yes. And the other thing that I remain fascinated by, if we're looking at someone like Cummings or we're looking at somebody like Johnson, is that the kinds of political capital, as it were, seem to really not change for them. They don't seem to really shoot themselves in the foot to the point that the electorate at large ends up betraying them or saying, oh, we've had enough. They may, like you said, have some noise moments or live in this period of noise, but that does not sustain itself to become a signal to actually do something when it comes to voting.
Yeah.
We saw this last December.
Well, I think that, I do think as well as challenging Dominic Cummings, analysts of him ought to accept and understand his challenge, right? He is saying lots of political coverage is too short term, it's too metropolitan, it ignores the view and the views and interests of lots of people who don't engage in politics, who don't live in big cities, who sometimes aren't well off, who are often more socially conservative than the average, and these people are not part of the dialogue or the calculations in politics. And him and Boris Johnson have got an audience. I noticed this immediately that Theresa May fell and Boris replaced her. Everything that Theresa May did, she had no friends for, right? Every error that happened, there were no friends for. That is not the case with this government. By the way, even in this particular instance where it's hard to pick out a line of defence, you can see people on social media who are virulently for Dominic Cummings, and they're not basing it, by the way, on any particular argument whether he didn't break the lockdown. They're just saying you're just pursuing him because you want to stop Brexit, or that you want to stop him from the sort of Brexit that they may or may not negotiate. Right? This is because obviously we've left, so they can't stop Brexit. But you get the point. There is a group of they have a base. Those people, right? There are real people who think that, and that doesn't mean you have to kind of give in to them saying things that are directly not true or accept their point of view on. Let's take Donald Trump, right? The work that Lynn Vavrek and John Sides and Michael Savage have done is clearly shows that Donald Trump's victory was powered by white voters who regard themselves absurdly as the subject of racial discrimination, right? A position that is essentially racist in its stupidity, that there is a strong, is mathematically clear that there is a strong racist element in the Trump vote, let alone the things that he says. And you can't propitiate that, and you can't ignore it. I don't believe that you should. So I don't think that just because there is a base for Donald Trump means that you have to celebrate that base or accept it. But you do have to. It does have to be part of your analysis. You do have to know it's there. You have to know where it lives geographically. You have to understand what might change its mind or move it on, how you might successfully challenge it, which can never be done just, by the way, by telling people they're stupid, because it doesn't work, understandably. So I'm rambling a bit, probably, but I do think that we have to understand the sources of the political power of this government, which won a very big majority. Part of that was about Jeremy Corbyn. I took the view personally that even if the government had gone into an election proposing no deal on Europe, I would have. I mean, I don't get to vote because I'm a member of the House of Lords, ludicrously. But I would have voted Conservative without any question, and I was happy they won because Jeremy Corbyn could not be Prime Minister. They can't rely on lots of people thinking that next time, by the way.
Right. And I mean, that's another whole story with the Corbyn situation. My goodness me. I think Keir Starmer is a lot more competent and a lot more about things. He's much more forensic. He's much more about things. I think Corbyn is a whole nother level. We could go and get lost in that.
It's not. There are two differences between Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn. One is there's a gulf of political ability, right, or a gulf of intellectual and political ability. I was never very impressed by Jeremy Corbyn's, sheer his ability to do certain things like, speak in the House of Commons or even give a platform speech, and sometimes his Prime Minister's questions to Theresa were terrible, ridiculous, the wrong subject and terribly phrased and all that sort of thing. And these are sort of very, you may think they're irrelevant skills, but they're not really, and I think the public were not very impressed. But the second thing is that they fundamentally are different. Keir Starmer is a liberal social democrat, right? So he's somebody whose politics is sort of civil liberties, libertarian, liberal view, and he's also a redistributionist and a social democrat. Jeremy Corbyn was, and I don't use this phrase. I don't use this phrase as some sort of silly insult. I'm trying to find a good way of describing it. But he basically was a Marxist or a communist, right? That was Jeremy Corbyn's view. Now, it belonged to a particular strand, which was a sort of post-Stalinist new left, which was anti-imperialist and kind of had its. And he was particularly keen on the kind of anti-colonial left in South America. So it's different. The reason why I'm mentioning all this is that I think the jump from Jeremy Corbyn to Keir Starmer is really big, and turns a party that, in my view, had to be prevented under almost all costs and against almost all opposition from being elected into one that is a credible choice for people. Right? It may, I think, and I think therefore that. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, if they want to keep a coalition between their new voters and old existing Conservative voters, that's going to be a more difficult task than it was last time.
Definitely so. Just a couple of other things. One, 4 years from now, 4.5 years from now, the next general is coming, and some people on Twitter are going, when this whole thing happened in mega amplification earlier in the week with Cummings, you had people on Twitter, this is the end of the Tories, and it's just nonsense. I mean, there's a lot. Politics is a lifetime. I mean, a week in politics is a lifetime. And
it's a very long period.
Yeah, and to write off Boris Johnson at this point, even with this going on, is a real folly, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as indeed was the folly that the Tories had when they won the next day after the last general election. The Tories had won kind of 2 elections. They've done so well they won the next election. I didn't believe that either. There's so much will determine the next election, and this will certainly not be it. I'm afraid they will have forgotten it more than you would imagine. Right? This is quite a big political event. Has a bit of cut through. But let's take as an example Westland, right? The helicopter purchasing scandal, I'm only saying, I know you know, but to remind listeners, that affected the Thatcher government in the middle of her second term. And Michael Heseltine resigned. It really shook the government. And in 1987, she won a huge victory, right? And it didn't figure at all. right? Despite the fact that for day upon day upon day, and they lost 2 cabinet ministers, one walked out, and Margaret Thatcher herself nearly fell. And in the end, I think much more serious for Boris Johnson is that he now faces a serious opposition, and elections are also won on the kind of physical state of the country, and there are 2 times when that matters. One is the peak, and the other is the end. In 1997, in many ways, at the end was quite benevolent for the Conservatives in terms of the economy, but the peak had been so bad that the party couldn't recover. It may be that that's what this moment is. Not I think Cummings actually, but the question of whether the government has handled the coronavirus well. We think we're too early in the process to be able to make a proper judgment about that. But once that judgment is in, that could turn out to be the peak, and then we'll see what happens at the end as well. And those are the 2 things that formulate people's view.
Yeah. Then the other thing that I was going to ask you about, though, is Brexit. And this is what a situation now. We've left but not left, because we're still under the auspices of the EU. This deadline is coming at the end of the year. And now it's clear that this border that was supposed to be in the Irish Sea is not going to be sustainable, or it's not going to be achieved by this deadline. And from what I know, Boris Johnson and the Tories are not going to extend this deadline. Now, the EU has asked them in the last couple of days to extend it for at least 2 years. What is your sense of these events, and what do you think about this deadline not being extended? What's your take on that?
I voted to remain in the European Union, but I accepted the result of the referendum. I was never in favour of leaving with no deal. In fact, I was stubbornly against that, and I voted against the government several times in the House of Lords, wrote consistently against not only the fact of leaving with no deal, but the tactics of doing it. I felt, and by no deal I didn't mean no trading agreement, I meant no withdrawal agreement. I thought that was completely unacceptable. During the general election, I said that I thought that the Conservative Party's position was entirely unrealistic. To put the 1 year target, saying we would leave by the end of the year, was pointless and made it more difficult to leave. But I remember I met somebody outside my son's school years and years ago who had been going through a divorce, and this was years later, and he was still writing letters to everybody about the injustice that had been done to him. And I took some time to try to persuade him that he should stop, because he was ruining his life doing it. And he didn't really want to listen to me. And there does come a point whereby we have litigated this issue. We had such a big debate. People like me, I think it's foolish what we're doing. I think it was foolish to leave the European Union. I think it's foolish to be in the position we are now. But I think the government has a mandate for its position on Europe.
More of my conversation with Daniel Finkelstein in just a moment. Welcome back to The Politicrat. We continue now with my conversation with Daniel Finkelstein.
I think what the government is doing is foolish. I thought it was wrong to leave the European Union. I feel it was foolish to leave, to promise, as the Conservatives did in their manifesto, to end the transition at the end of this year. I made that argument at the time. I made it during the general election. At some point, you have to say, well, I think they have got a mandate for this. We can't keep on arguing about it forever. So I disagree with it. If it's up to me, I'm not going to vote in favour of that. But I accept that people did.
Right. Absolutely. Well, the one other thing, and I promise this is going to be the last thing. I mean, I could talk to you.
It's a pleasure to talk.
It's lovely to talk to you. Absolutely. Because one of the things that and I do want to go back to this thing about Dominic Cummings, but before even doing that, I want to get to, do you think, because this coronavirus situation is an absolute, I think both governments, obviously here in the US, but I think my native country, the UK's government, has absolutely it's just been a shambles. It's been absolutely shocking, personally, I think. in terms of the way the response has gone. Will that not affect the calculus of the of election at all? Do you think?
Okay. So my view on this is a slightly more complicated one. It may turn out that what we did by delaying lockdown by a week or 10 days, that was a big error. I think it'll certainly turn out that it would have been better if we'd had enough testing facilities, but also I think it probably will emerge that it was a mistake, and quite a big mistake, and then there'll be a debate about whether that was poor scientific advice, or what I suspect, which was a combination of mistaken scientific advice and the government not pressing the scientists for better advice early enough. Right? I think that's all quite likely, but it isn't certain that that's correct. The truth is that the way viruses work, everybody who hasn't had it and isn't immune is vulnerable to it, and unless we're going to lock down forever, people will remain vulnerable to it. The assumption that we made a mistake not locking down early enough is the assumption that at the end of the lockdown, the countries are going to be able to control coronavirus. They won't have second peaks, and they'll be able to live some sort of life after lockdown while living with coronavirus. This will either be because we have a vaccine or because we can make contact and trace work. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And if it isn't the case. And there is a perfectly compelling case, which we do not know about yet, that in a year's time we'll all end up having the same sort of rough proportion of excess deaths. Because I don't see why, once we reduce lockdown, we're going to easily control this virus. It may be that we can. And if we can, then clearly, if we can control it forever until the point where we get a vaccine, then clearly you will not need herd immunity. That the government therefore made a mistake with the delay. But otherwise, we've simply lost more people earlier. Right now, I just don't know whether that's true or not. At the moment, because I'm so hopeful that we can make contact and trace work, I'm hoping we made an error, right? Because that means, I know that sounds a bit funny, but what that means is we can now move on. But I also fear that may not be true. That actually, in the end, you can only really solve the problem by social distancing forever, right? Or at least social distancing for potentially years. I don't know how practical that is, Omar. So I just, as I say, I think it is too early. The way that I put it is, we know the government's made mistakes, but we don't know what they are yet, and let's wait. And then we can make an inquiry into whether the government's position was mistaken and in what way. If you look at the early scientific interviews, right, of people like John Edwards and Chris Vallance and others, right, they all make this point, the point that I'm making to you now, that nobody makes anymore, right? Which is, we aren't really going to be able to get over this until we've got some level of herd immunity. Nobody makes that point anymore, but it doesn't mean it's not true anymore. It may be that we don't need it because we're able to stop it spreading to people, but we weren't before. And maybe the contact trace effort is big enough, will be possible to make it succeed. But before we conclude that, let us just hold off for a second on saying that, we're basically, it's a bit like you're going into a race. They've all gone around the bend the first time, but it's a 3-lap race, and you're sort of declaring the winner at this point, or the loser. That's too early, Now, as I say, it really doesn't. Doesn't mean it wasn't an error. I think it's a perfectly tenable view that it was. But they did that. The scientists were doing it because they had a theory, and as yet, we don't know whether that theory was correct. They abandoned it in favour of, because they sort of lost their nerve on it, really. and I think they were probably right to. But we'll see.
Right. You said they're probably right to on herd immunity?
No, to abandon. So the thing about herd immunity is nobody wants herd immunity.
And look what's going on in Sweden with it.
Yeah, but the point about Sweden, right, is that Giesecke doesn't say people won't die if we have herd immunity. What he says is, in the end, that's the only way that it's going to stop, right? So there are only two ways that we can make this stop, right? One is, three ways. There's a vaccine, but the vaccine produces herd immunity, right? So it's basically two ways. But a herd immunity either produced naturally or through a vaccine, or by a control, contact and tracing system forever, right? Those are the two options, okay? I wonder about the practicality of that second approach, is all I'm saying. I have actually supported the lockdown simply because, and I did support, and I do think probably, I hope to goodness we get a vaccine, so we get the herd immunity that way, right? Because getting it the other way, I think Ferguson was correct. I think that the problem is hundreds of thousands of people die like that. So it can't be an objective of policy. The question, however, is how else does it stop, right? It's not so much whether it's an objective. No one's going to say that. The reason people talked about going out and getting herd immunity, by the way, was because what Valence and others thought was that would maybe help the older people to stay at home while younger people gathered herd immunity that would help the older people later, right? One way of dealing with this is the younger people go out, they gain herd immunity, and then you can release the older people into the population because it no longer spreads, okay? Because everyone's got immunity. That's not a stupid theory about how to deal with this. They concluded it wouldn't work because older people would get it. It would be hard to shield, and I think Sweden does show that actually. Yes. But that doesn't mean that in the end, even though herd immunity isn't what we're aiming for, we don't end up. It only stops when we get it. I mean, let's give you an example. Okay, yeah. These are immunity certificates. Okay, so that means people who've had it can go out, and the people who haven't had it stays in. How do the people who are staying in ever get immune?
No, I know what you're saying.
Are they supposed to stay in their home forever? Right? So how realistic is all this? And I'm only saying this because I just want to be realistic. I think I want us to be realistic about what we're in for, what the policy problems are, and the rush to say, because the people in Sweden have all died, that is what you would expect to happen with their approach.
The question is it the best approach, or is it the right approach?
The alternative? Yeah. So what I'm saying is the alternative to natural herd immunity stopping this is only two things. One is a vaccine, which of course we all hope for. Nobody thinks that wouldn't be a good thing. And if a vaccine came along tomorrow, clearly it would mean that those who locked down early would have fewer deaths. That's obviously the right thing to do, right? The other possibility is that we make contact and tracing work forever. That is what South Korea is trying to do. But if you look at that, the prospect of making that work in a Western liberal trading democracy, it is difficult. Maybe I'm not, enough of an expert to know whether it will work. I know that you look at Germany, you think, well, maybe they can make it work and still have a large degree of freedom. And let's see.
Yeah, we will.
And until we know that, we cannot know whether the approach. It's just the idea that we can yet know whether Sweden's approach was correct. This isn't the stage at which you judge that, because the whole thesis of Giesecke is that it'll all even itself out over a year. That's what he's actually said, right? So, well, I'm not an epidemiologist, but Giesecke is like a prop. In other words, Giesecke's not. My wife's an epidemiologist and of infectious diseases at Public Health England, actually, and I know because she's had Giesecke's book, and I've got it on my desk at the moment, actually, for years, because he is when she was doing her master's course, a state-of-the-art epidemiologist and policymaker. He's not a fringe figure. And the things that our epidemiologists were saying, which were the same as his, are perfectly mainstream views, right? At the moment, it doesn't look to me like they were correct, but it is too early to judge whether that's right or not. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wait. We're going to wait, and in a year's time, we can make that judgment.
I hear exactly where you're coming from, and I know that certainly Sweden has people have expressed misgivings, but I understand exactly where your perspective is on that. I think
it wouldn't have been the policy I'd have followed, to be honest.
Right.
To be honest, admittedly, I wasn't there. So admittedly, I sort of gained this later, but to my mind, I see why the others began the policy of lockdown earlier, but we are at precisely the point which was part of the government's thesis, which is we can't carry this on forever. Lockdown will have to be released, and look at it. People are beginning to say, let's leave a lockdown. It's important that by the time we do that, if nobody's had it, it'll just all start again. Well, that's possibly what will happen.
Yes. One last thing, and this is back to Dominic Cummings again. Do you think he's a sinister figure? I mean, there are a lot of people who talk about him having ulterior motives. He had the Vote Leave campaign. He's somebody that they're not comfortable with. Do you think he's somebody who has more power in a way than the Prime Minister does, or has as much power? Because it's always that number two person, I believe, that tends to have a lot more power and influence than the number one person that we see out there. What's your take on all of that?
So I've got two differences with Dominic Cummings. One is I don't share the view that he and Boris Johnson are persuaded of, or which Boris, certainly the platform on which Boris won the general election and won the leadership of the Conservative Party. Whether or not you think Boris genuinely thinks that or not, I don't know, because he was used to regard him as a liberal Conservative ally, and I don't think he won the leadership on that basis. So the first thing is my politics is slightly different. I think the future of the Conservative Party should be, and the future of the country, it lies with the future of the country, and the future of the country is to become more liberal, more urban, more diversified, and the Conservative Party is moving away from that audience. I think that is a strategic mistake, even if it yields tactical advantage. It also, and this of course I've got to be self-aware, it also moves it away somewhat from me, so I can see that. And so the first is I have a political disagreement, but that doesn't make him sinister. That simply means he put together a platform which quite a lot of people think is correct. It's not mad, in my view, to want to leave the European Union. I didn't want to do it myself on balance, but I don't think the arguments are idiotic or mad or only xenophobic or stupid. I think there are perfectly tenable arguments behind it. And if you look at the European Union's performance during the coronavirus case, you can see that it's an institution with a lot of power, but also a lot of trouble. Right. So that would be my first thing. I have a different disagreement about that. Doesn't make him sinister. Secondly, and this I tread a little bit more carefully here because my dealings with him have been personal dealings with him are so limited. I mean, almost non-existent really. But my view, from reading his blogs or from listening to his speeches, they're always intellectually really fascinating. I don't think he's wrong about challenges to the civil service completely. I don't think he's wrong about challenges to the media completely. But I do think that his kind of whole position, which is everyone's a bit stupid, except me, which is his public stance. Fun enough, I don't think he's like that as a person, judging from when I've watched him say these. But I think that is his kind of intellectual position. His complete dismissal of David Cameron and Ed Llewellyn as the most stupid people he'd ever encountered was ridiculous, and I think he suffers from that a bit. I don't think that's an attractive trait politically. And I think, but I don't think I would use the word sinister to describe him. But I certainly think that certain things that are very important, the rule of law. I happen to also, think the BBC is a very important institution. I think the Conservative Party wants to have a sort of broad liberal appeal. I don't want to fight a culture war, certainly not on the culturally conservative side. All of those things, I think Dominic Cummings wouldn't probably see eye to eye with me on. And I worry about those things a bit, yeah.
Yeah. Really good talking to you. I would talk to you about Premier League football. I heard Gary Lineker tweet something, or he tweeted something today, or recently, about Premier League coming back in June 17th or something. I don't know if that's true or not. I didn't have time to find...
True, yeah.
Is it? Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that's good news. Hopefully Watford do not get relegated. I pray my team does. Danny, it's wonderful. What a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for coming on this edition of The Politicrat. Thank you. One correction to make. I inadvertently said the Scottish First Minister had resigned. That is not correct. The Chief Medical Officer for the Scottish First Minister resigned. The Scottish First Minister is, of course, Nicola Sturgeon. The Chief Medical Officer who resigned, her name is Dr. Catherine Calderwood. I want to thank Daniel Finkelstein again for being on this edition of The Politicrat. Daniel Finkelstein is a columnist at the Times of London, and he is a Conservative member of the House of Lords at Westminster in central London. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I am Omar Moore.